I never expected a weekend under the stars to become a catalog of things that would not let me sleep. It was late August, Pine Hollow Campground, a clear night with a thin crescent moon, and I had driven up with a car full of gear and a head full of plans to unplug for 3 days. I was 32 then, tired from city work, hungry for quiet, with a small backpack of books and an old camera that smelled faintly of leather and motor oil. Tents were pitched in neat rows, children ran with glow sticks, the air tasted like smoke and cinnamon from the communal fire ring, and the smell of wet earth rose every time a breeze hollowed through the pines. We ate s'mores and laughed at inside jokes until the embers glowed low. Somewhere, between the normal and the night, a voice spoke outside my tent. It was not a child's voice, and it did not sound like any neighbor. It said my name. I would spend the next 3 stories tracing how that voice found me again, and how the same line of sound unstitched the safety of 3 different trips. By the end, I would tell you what I heard, what the rangers wrote down, and why that single sound kept echoing in my head. If you have ever felt something small and ordinary turn into terror, stay with me. Can a voice be the thing that follows you home? I had been camping before, but not like that summer. My backstory was a patchwork of short stays at friends' places, one disastrous night in a college cabin where the heater failed and the rain came through the eaves, and a grandmother who taught me how to identify edible berries and how to make tea from pine needles. I had learned early to treat nature with both reverence and a little skepticism. I worked as a freelance photographer then, shooting portraits and landscapes, which meant I paid attention to small details, to light and to pattern. I saved weekend trips like prayers, packing a cooler with food measured to last, a thermos that kept coffee hot for hours, a flashlight whose beam I trusted like a companion, and a notebook where I wrote tiny, exact notes about people I met on the trail. I was the person who would stop and listen to the birds, who noticed the way a leaf shook differently when an animal passed, who smelled something out of place and wrote it down. That habit made me a careful witness when things went wrong. It also meant I remembered more than most, down to how the zipper on the tent scraped the first time I opened it in the morning, and the faint metallic taste of fear when someone whispered under my canvas in the night. I had friends who camped more loudly than I did, who brought Bluetooth speakers and elaborate lanterns, and others who traveled light. On that August weekend, Sarah and Mark were with me, and their presence would matter in ways I could not have predicted. I wrote notes on every trip, simple things at first: who laughed too loud, who slept beneath a canopy of stars, who kept a pocket knife within reach. Later, those notes became evidence in my own mind, a timeline I read over and over to help me not feel like I had imagined the voice. The first night felt unremarkable until it did not. We had set up camp near the far edge of Pine Hollow, where the trees thinned and you could see the black curve of the lake. Firelight hit faces with warm color. The air smelled of toasted marshmallow and wet canvas. Somewhere beyond the fire, a dog barked and was told to hush. Music from a distant campsite drummed a steady beat that blended with the chirp of crickets. I remember the texture of the sleeping bag fabric under my palm and the coolness of the grass against my bare feet when I went to get more water. The tent flap was zippered closed at midnight, the headlamp turned down to a dim amber. A small radio my friends had brought clicked into static and then silence. I had just propped my camera near my sleeping pad, planning to take a dawn picture of mist on the lake, when a voice said my name outside the tent. It was soft and close, the syllables rounded as if the person speaking had something precious or fragile in their mouth. The sound of it should have been a neighbor, a friendly mistake. Instead, it had an intentional pause on the last letter, a careful waiting that made every hair on my arm stand up. I unzipped a crack, peered out, and saw nothing but the black line of trees and a reflected sliver of moon on the water. My throat tightened. I called back, "Who is there?" And the voice simply repeated my name, closer now, the breath audible against the canvas like a small bell. I pulled the zipper open and stepped out, my sneakers crunchy with pine needles, the air cold enough to taste metal.
I flashed my light along the path, along the picnic table, toward the tree line. No one answered. My friends heard me and came out in yawns, prodded by adrenaline and sleep. We walked the perimeter until the ranger parked his truck with headlights slicing through mist and told us to return to our site and lock the tent. We did, uneasy and joking thinly about wild pranksters. That night, the sound of a voice continued to loop in my head like a note between songs. It was the first string in a longer chord of things that would not sit still. The second day unfolded with the normal acrobatics of a campsite trying to forgive a worried night. We hiked a trail called Old Mill that day.
Its path littered with shale and the smell of crushed pine resin. The trail was alive with birds and the metallic tang of stream water. I remember the sound of my boots on stone and Mark singing off-key to fill the silence. We passed other hikers, traded smiles and small talk, names like currency. Jenna, who had the keenest sense for edible mushrooms, pointed out a ring of fungi with a laugh and a soft touch. We collected water from a spring, the taste clean and cold like nothing in the city. That afternoon, a local family told us about a missing camper from 2 years prior, a story that had the ring of an old wound. They mentioned how a voice was reported outside a tent, how the missing person had walked into the night and never returned. The story should have been background noise, something to remind us to lock our food boxes and keep to the trail, but the detail of the voice lodged like a splinter. In the evening, the ranger, Tom, gave a safety talk by the ranger station. He was a broad-shouldered man with a voice like a boat engine and a worn cap. He walked through the protocol for a missing person report and the search patterns they used. He explained that they logged last known positions, canvassed campsites, and checked vehicle logs. I wrote down his words in my notebook. Later, lying awake with the tent quiet except for the whisper of canvas and the distant drone of an insect, I tasted the coffee grounds I had swallowed too fast that afternoon, bitter and stale, and tried to decide if my fear was caution raised to a fever or a necessary survival signal. The first incident began as a knock. It was late enough that the campground's hum had thinned to a few muffled radios and distant laughter. I heard a quick rap on the tent and a voice, a simple, "Hey you." My voice was small when I answered, "Yes?" There were 8 lines in that exchange, if I counted the way it unfolded in the dark. "Are you awake?" the voice asked. "Yes, who is it?" I said. "It is fine," the voice said. "I am looking for a friend." "What friend?" I asked. "You will know when you see them," the voice said. I lay rigid and listened. The person outside moved slow, the scrape of boots on gravel precise and methodical. "It is only a short walk to the water," the voice offered. I felt unreasonable bravery and called for Mark and Sarah. They stumbled out in shirts and with headlamps, voices thick with sleep. "Is everything okay?" Mark asked. "Someone is outside," I said. "He said he is looking for a friend." Sarah flashed the light, and the beam swept over the picnic table, then past the shrubs. "There is no one," she said. "Maybe an animal." The voice called my name again, patient and oddly amused. We called to it. We repeated questions. It answered with riddles. The exchange went on until Ranger Tom's truck lights moved along the road, and then the voice fell away like a tide. We were told to file a report and to consider it a trespass complaint. The officers who came took our statements with careful pens and slow eyes. At the time, I thought the voice was a prank. Later, I would think of the precision in those steps and the odd familiarity with my name, and understand the voice had not been random. The response to that night unfolded into a mix of institutional calm and practical alarm. Ranger Tom and Officer Hernandez spoke to us at length by the ranger station, the echo of their conversation crisp in the night air. "Did you see anyone's face?" Hernandez asked. "No," I said, my stomach cold. "Only shadows." "Did you hear any vehicle?" he asked. "No, only a voice." "Do you keep valuables in your tent?" Tom asked. "Just cameras and a phone," Mark said. The officers took statements, wrote the time and our names, checked registration logs in a notebook the size of a Bible. Their protocol was methodical. They described their missing person procedure as a grid search, beginning from last sighting and expanding outward in concentric sweeps, notifying adjacent jurisdictions and logging volunteer searches. Their description was concise and technical. They said they would check camera footage from the lake area and the entrance gate, they would speak to other campers, and they would advise us to lock up and sleep in shifts. That night, volunteers walked the rows, flashlights cutting white slashes through the trees. We spoke with neighbors like Lewis, a man who camped solo and who swore he had seen headlights on the access road an hour before. David, whose 2 small sons had been playing near our fire, described a shadow that moved too cleanly to be a deer. Emily, an elderly woman in the next loop, held a thermos and shook her head when she said she heard faint whistling. Names piled up and formed a small chorus of witnesses, each offering a detail that fit into a larger picture. The officers explained that they would file the trespass and assign an officer to canvass the area in the morning, and then they left with their lights going. I wrote everything down, as if my pen could hold the truth for me, because memory had already begun to warp the shape of the night. We were told to be vigilant, but also to resume normal activities. That instruction was a thread I pulled on and found it unraveled everything. The second story in my series took place 2 weeks later on a different trail, with different people, but an eerily similar sound. This time I had gone with Jenna and Rachel, 2 friends who like to plan precise itineraries, route sheets, waterproof, maps folded into neat squares, and Ziploc bags labeled with snacks. We camped at Lake Wren, a quieter place with a park office but fewer campers and longer stretches of pines. The first night was full of ordinary mistakes. Rachel left the lantern out, Jenna flung the tent flap open and let in a breeze that smelled of lake algae, and I burned too many marshmallows while trying to perfect the crust of caramel on the outside. The second night we had agreed to sleep by schedule, to keep watches, to stick to the plan I had written in a small notebook. At around 2 in the morning, I heard a voice outside the tent calling Rachel's full name. It said it as if it had admired the name for a long time. The way it landed on each syllable sounded practiced. I flung the flap and saw nothing but tree silhouettes and a strip of moon silvering the water. I shone the headlamp, and the light found nothing but a ripple on the lake. We stepped out, boots wet with dew, and walked to the edge. There was evidence of footprints in the mud, 2 sets, one going west along the shoreline and one turning toward the service road. I followed the prints a short distance and found they faded into the moss. The prints were spaced in an awkward gait. Jenna called into the trees, voice pitched to Carrie. The voice outside answered with a soft humming, and then with the sound of Rachel's name again. That time, the voice spoke as if it had been listening to her for days, the cadence almost affectionate and a little hungry. I remember the taste of gat spray and the itchy feel of it on my skin. The officers took our statement the next morning and described how they would run scent units if available and coordinate with other agencies. Their procedural explanation was precise and short. It described tracking in concentric rings, establishing a command point, and liaising with volunteer search and rescue teams. It was dry and clinical. We were given numbers to call and told to expect follow-up. That sense of institutional motion made me feel both reassured and oddly abandoned. The voice had found us again, and the official machinery moved predictably around the edges. The third incident was the one that lodged like a splinter under a fingernail. It happened on a solo trip I took the following autumn, a small getaway to clear my head after 2 strange summer nights. The campground was named Birch Hollow and was known for its quiet and wide loops. I pitched my tent near a small stream and slept with the rainfly open, a decision born of foolish bravado and the desire to hear the water. I woke to rain and the smell of damp wool and the steamy perfume of earth. That night I had the uneasy feeling of being watched, a trivial fear I told myself and then ignored. The voice that found me there did not say my name at first. It sang. It was a low humming, like 2 notes held at once, the sound of someone trying to create a lullaby and failing. I unzipped, stepped out into a drizzle, and saw a figure at the tree line, hunched like a silhouette cut from paper, hands in pockets, shoulders tense. I called, "Can I help you?" And the figure tilted its head. "I was lost," it said. "I heard the water, and I followed it." "Are you hurt?" I asked. "No, only tired," the figure said. "Can I sit for a while?" The exchange thickened with politeness and shared loneliness. "There are rules about camping spaces," I said. "You should check in at the office." "I do not like offices," the figure said. "They have fluorescent light." When I asked for identification, the person named no name. We spoke in at least 8 distinct turns, building a fragile template of trust that I would later undo. I offered tea, then coffee, then the offer of a blanket. The person refused delicately. They had a small limp I saw when they stepped forward, an odd hitch at the ankle. When I asked about companions, the answer was vague, stories thin and circular, as if the person had told himself an explanation to keep moving. At one point, the figure asked me for my name, and then said it in a voice that matched something from earlier that year. It was the echo I could not place. Later, after the person had walked away into the dark, I found footprints that suggested more than one set of shoes, prints layered and overlapping, as if someone had walked around the tent several times before stopping. I photographed them and wrote down everything in my notebook, hands raw from cold and from the tremor that had settled into me. Moments of tension came in waves and were longer than the simple beats of fear people expect. The first moment stretched for nearly a half hour as Ranger Tom and Officer Hernandez coordinated a walk through the camp, their voices low and the beam of the flashlight too bright for comfortable sleep. I felt every crunch of gravel under their boots, as if it were a physical blow. My pulse matched the rhythm of their steps. The second moment was a bitter, cold hush on the second night at Lake Wren when the search dogs arrived and the handlers let them loose. The dogs ran with my chest in their mouths, noses flat to the ground, and their handlers shouted commands that split the air. The third was a tight, hot pocket of fear in Birch Hollow, when the figure at the tree line said a single phrase that matched a voicemail I had deleted 3 months earlier. Those moments were not instantaneous. They elongated into slow film in my head, where each breath, each noise, each rustle was magnified. I remember the way my vision narrowed into slashes of silver and black and the taste of copper on the tongue. I remember the hands of strangers on my shoulders when the search parties passed by, and the way my own hands shook so much I could not sign the forms without a blot of ink. I could not move past those hours easily. In all 3 cases, the community reacted fast and in familiar patterns. Neighbors offered blankets, cars were lent, names were exchanged in a way that made you feel less alone and oddly more exposed. I recorded at least 8 names in my notebook that appeared repeatedly across conversations. Sarah and Mark were there on the first night, their jokes fraying as the event stretched. Jenna and Rachel were the companions of the second story, meticulous and sharp, with a readiness that proved useful when tracing a strange set of footprints. Luis, an elderly man with a soft voice, insisted the trespasser had been humming a tune with words he could not understand. David, with 2 small boys, described the shape of a coat he saw beyond the trees. Emily, who lived seasonally in her van, brought thermos after thermos and said little but listened, as if compiling a map in her head. Tom the ranger became the pivot of our confidence. Officer Hernandez logged each statement as if stapling the night into a record. Marcus, who led a volunteer search team, coordinated the initial canvass. The names circled and retold the nights in ways that hardened the story into a communal memory. Each person had small variations in their recollection, but the voice, the calling of a name, the careful approach, and the footprints were repeated details that refused to be dismissed. Investigations followed templates that were annoyingly familiar and, in other ways, maddeningly slow. The ranger office recorded the events with checklists. The police logged our reports, took photographs of the footprints and the tent, and asked for copies of our notes and camera metadata. A procedural explanation of the search and evidence processing is important and precise. After a report is filed, the first step is containment and canvass to secure the scene and determine witnesses.
Next is evidence collection that includes photographs, collection of footprints or fabric where present, and collection of video from nearby sources. The case is then logged into a regional system and cross-checked with prior reports for patterns. That processing took time and involved coordination with a county seat some miles away. The rangers pushed for a perimeter check and asked for volunteer teams to register at the command post. Officer Hernandez explained the next day that they would seek any surveillance footage from the park entrance and nearby private properties, check vehicle logs, and cross-reference the timestamps with other reports. That paced us into a patient, bureaucratic waiting. It felt both comforting and exasperating to watch formality move while the sound that had unsettled us waited only in memory. Procedural clarity gave us steps to follow and names to call, but it also created the illusion that the problem existed within documents and not within the thin fabric of our tents. Rumors fanned out like dry leaves. The story about the person who had disappeared 2 years before returned, carried by other campers and reshaped in the telling. Someone said that a transient man had once wandered through the campground before dusk and later been spotted at a convenience store. And another said that a couple of years ago a woman had vanished from a nearby trail. Each retelling added a detail, and each detail made the voice easier to slot into a familiar horror. Social media did what it does best and amplified the story into an account that reached beyond the trees of Pine Hollow. Posts with blurred photos and shaky video of headlights at the entrance drew comments from those who had never been and from those who claimed to know more. At least 8 different versions of what had happened circulated within 24 hours, each a small scab of a narrative that people poked at with curiosity. I found myself reading comments under a thin lamplight in the ranger office, feeling the slow churn of attention and the odd shame of being a small part of a sensational thread. This is where the CTA fits and where I will ask you to pause. If you were in my place in the middle of that night when the canvas had a voice and the rangers walked with flashlights, what would you have done? Take a breath and imagine it. The question matters because it is a way to test our instincts. Share in the comments, start your answer with "I would have" or "I would not," and tell one small thing you think you would have done differently. Your input helps others think practically about safety and also builds a communal sense that we are not alone in our fear. We want to hear whether you would have trusted the voice, called for backup, or stayed silent. Your story may help someone else choose to lock their tent, to sleep in pairs, or to carry a whistle. It also creates a space where practical tips and emotional support can exist together. The aftermath of these incidents threaded into my life in small ways that accumulated. I could not look at a campground map without imagining the places a voice could hide. I avoided sleeping with the tent flap open after Birch Hollow. I began to carry a small handheld radio with pre-tuned emergency channels and a whistle I clipped to my pack. Friends changed their own camping habits after our stories, checking in more often and downloading the county ranger numbers to their phones. Legally, there were few levers to pull. Trespass complaints led to warnings and occasional patrol sweeps, but not to immediate arrests. When something like a voice crossed the boundary of stranger and crime, the law often required a physical act to proceed. The absence of a physical assault made prosecution difficult. Officer Hernandez explained in a compact, detailed way how the county pursued misdemeanors and felonies when evidence met burden, but how intangible events like an anonymous voice without follow-up were tricky. His procedural explanation held to 3 clear stages: initial report and canvass, evidence gathering and suspect identification where possible, and escalation to the county if a pattern emerged. The explanation, 300 characters, would summarize, showed the limits of immediate response and why patterns across time matter. It was both a technical insight and a frustration. It explained why our nights remained stories rather than cases closed. The psychological impact was more persistent than any report or patrol.
For months after the first August night, I would wake at odd times and hear a noise that I could not place, a brush of canvas that sounded like a voice. I developed a ritual of checking the perimeter of any campsite I occupied before settling in, running a light along paths where shadows pooled, and double-checking that my tent zipper was fully closed. My sleep fragmented into small naps rather than long, restful stretches. I kept seeing the shape of the person at Birch Hollow in the corner of my eye, a black silhouette with an odd tilt to the shoulders. It was harder to quantify how it spilled into daily life. I moved with a heightened awareness in parking lots and near dark doorways, listening for the cadence of voices I had heard in the woods. The community response helped. Sarah and Mark brought food the next time I slept in town and insisted on staying up with me until dawn. Jenna sent links to articles about missing persons and how to register for volunteer search teams. Luis made me a simple charm from twine and a small rock. Those small acts read like stitches repaired to a torn garment. I started to write a set of practical steps I called my safety list. Sleep with a companion if possible, inform the ranger of any odd contact, record voice memos when things happen, and always, always keep a light on. The list was a way to move from helplessness into action. 1 month after the first incident, I was still raw. The hairline scars of memory were bright, and the name of the campsite felt too close. I had stopped camping alone for a while and instead joined a small group of friends for an overnight near a river. Sarah came with a thermos of strong coffee, Mark brought marshmallows and jokes, and David set up a portable lantern that hummed with a domestic certainty. I wrote in my notebook about safety and about the thin line between caution and avoiding life. The ranger office had posted a new sign about overnight policies, and the command desk had a little
More staff in the weekends. Ranger Tom texted a group message with a reminder about check-ins and a phone number for after-hours calls. I tried to measure my progress in moments when I laughed and did not immediately check for the sound of a voice outside. The friends around me said they noticed I was more attentive and softer around strangers. Their support helped me out of loops of replaying the nights. The community had been a net I did not know I could rely on. 3 months in, I had begun to treat the stories as part of my work as well as my life. I returned to Pine Hollow with a focused intention to document. I interviewed neighbors and compiled their accounts. Jenna talked at length about the prints at Lake Wren and provided photographs. Officer Hernandez gave me a copy of the patrol log, where the repeated entries of unknown voice appeared like a small, steady drum. Marcus from the volunteer search team lent his notes on pattern analysis and told me about other irregular calls. I found a fellow named Lewis who swore the humming was like a song used in a far-off village, a rhythm that did not belong to our forests. Those interviews helped me assemble a layered narrative that felt true and not merely sensational. I also found that the more I spoke about the nights, the less power they had over me. I was still careful. I still checked locks and zippers. But speaking untangled some of the strangest knots. I learned that naming was a form of control. 6 months later, I had started to sleep longer and to think of the incidents as weather instead of earthquakes. I led a small workshop on campsite safety at the ranger station, sitting with a group of 20 hikers and campers, and taught the safety list I had developed. We practiced calling in a canny, calm voice and logging unusual events. I watched faces absorb the steps like a map. Some people came up after and said they felt reassured. I met Emily again and learned she had begun to volunteer at the local shelter, taking the energy of anxious nights and turning it into service. Tom the ranger said the pattern of calls had not disappeared entirely, but had become less frequent as people adopted tighter habits around check-ins and campsite awareness. I still carried a photo of the footprints that night at Birch Hollow, and when I looked at it, I felt a complicated gratitude. The voice had changed me, taught me boundaries and small practices that felt like armor. The legal side of things had been slow and unsatisfying. There were polite letters from the county informing us that reports were logged and that cases would be reactivated if new evidence surfaced. A search of regional databases revealed other similar entries, which were filed under the rubric of suspicious activity but were not connected to any arrest. It was an administrative gray zone that frustrated those of us who kept meticulous notes. I pushed for the department to catalog all such incidents together to look for patterns. Officer Hernandez agreed that cross-referencing reports could be useful and promised to include our reports in a small internal review. He explained, precisely and in plain terms, that without an identifiable suspect and physical evidence, the chance of prosecution remained low. He also said that the assembly of consistent reports could change that calculus. It was an awkward consolation. In the end, I wrote about the nights because I needed to. I documented how a voice could shift a place from safe to suspect, how institutional responses often mattered even as they felt insufficient, and how the small acts of community could mend the edges of fear. The last time the voice called to me was a year after the first night, from a campsite 3 valleys over where I had gone for solitude and landscape work. I heard my name and I stepped out with a lantern, resolved and watchful. There was no figure, only a thin skiff of smoke from a distant fire. I shone the light and spoke in a firm voice. "Whoever you are, you need to leave the camp area." My voice did not tremble. That night I learned to respond with the language of procedure and the calm of ritual. I learned to say the right words into the dark. If this story matters to you, if the rasp of a voice at your tent door makes you think of what you would do, consider subscribing for more accounts like this. I tell these stories because they teach us how to act in small, practical ways. There are steps to take and routines to build that make a night in the woods less likely to become a memory you must live inside of. Share what you would have done in the comments. Tell us one small change you make now because of this story. Your contribution helps create collective safety that is stronger than any single pair of hands. Memory is a stubborn tenant. Sometimes a voice is only a voice. Sometimes it is a warning. Sometimes it is a stranger with a story that is human and sad. But sometimes a voice that calls your name is an invitation into danger. The line between those possibilities is why we keep watch and why we write things down. When I think back, I see the tremor of a tent zipper under a moon that was arranged like a scythe, a little smear of mud on my shoe from prints that did not match any of ours, the slow, patient way a person outside the canvas would call a name as if practicing a key. The factual detail is simple and ordinary. The rangers assembled a report and the officers logged our statements. The campground remained open because the law needed more than a voice to shutter a place. The lesson is practical and quietly urgent. Trust your sense of discomfort. Sleep in pairs when you can. Keep a light near at hand. Make a plan and share it with someone. If something sounds off, report it and record it. The next time a voice speaks outside a tent, make your name an answer and make your safety the priority. If these stories matter to you, subscribe to hear more accounts and to learn small steps that can make a difference. Sometimes the night is only night. Sometimes it is a voice just beyond the canvas. Sometimes it is both.